"Good morning, Slim," she said loudly across the counter, smiling like she'd just handed me a compliment. My stomach dropped, and the smell of buttercream suddenly felt too sweet in my throat. The bell over the door hadn't even finished chiming when her voice cut through the shop again, casual, familiar, like she owned the air. I stood there with a tray of cooling cupcakes in my hands, heat seeping through the paper liners into my palms, and felt every pair of eyes flick toward me. There were only 6 of us in that tiny space, but it felt crowded in the worst way, like a room that had decided to watch instead of help. I set the tray down carefully, too carefully, as if one wrong movement might crack something in me. The overhead lights hummed, harsh and unforgiving, bleaching the counters and making my reflection in the glass case look thinner than I already was. I hadn't been here long. 8 days. 8 mornings of learning the register, the ovens, the rhythm of frosting and filling orders. 8 days of telling myself I could handle a new place, a fresh start at my age. She leaned against the prep table, arms folded, eyes scanning me the way people do when they think they're being playful. "You need to eat," she added, shaking her head. "All bones." No one laughed. No one spoke. The silence sat there, thick and awkward, like batter left too long to rise. I felt my jaw tighten. I had asked her before, quietly, politely, twice. I told her I didn't like nicknames, didn't like comments about my body. She'd waved it off, said it was just how she talked, said I was being sensitive. Yesterday, when I asked again, she'd looked me straight in the eye and said it was her mouth and she could say what she wanted. I wiped my hands on my apron even though they weren't dirty. The fabric was stiff from too many washes, rough against my fingers. "Please don't call me that," I said, keeping my voice level. I could hear it, the effort it took not to let it shake. She shrugged, exaggerated, turning it into a performance. "Relax. Being skinny is a compliment." The owner was in the back, pretending to inventory boxes he'd already counted. I'd gone to him before this morning, told him I felt uncomfortable, told him it felt like harassment. He'd sighed, tired, and said it was a high school issue, something we should figure out ourselves. Standing there now, I understood exactly what that meant. He wasn't going to step in. He wasn't going to make it stop. She tilted her head, studying me, waiting for my reaction like a child poking at something fragile to see if it would break. "Morning, Slim," she repeated, softer this time, almost intimate. Something in me snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a clean, sharp break. I heard my own voice before I fully decided to use it. "Morning, Chunky," I said. The word landed heavier than I expected. It didn't echo. It didn't need to. Her face changed instantly. The smile vanished, replaced by a stunned blankness, then a flush that crept up her neck. Her eyes filled, fast and bright, and she inhaled sharply like she'd been slapped. "Why would you say that?" she asked, her voice cracking. The room shifted, chairs scraped. Someone muttered my name. Another coworker stepped closer to her, placing a hand on her arm. I stood there, rooted to the tile floor, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The same people who'd stayed silent for days suddenly found their voices. "That's not the same," someone said. "You can't call her that." "She's just joking with you," another added, glancing at me with a frown. "Being called skinny isn't an insult." She started crying then, real tears spilling over, shoulders shaking. It was loud, messy, impossible to ignore. The owner finally emerged from the back, eyes wide, hands raised like he'd walked into a fire he didn't want to fight. "What's going on?" he asked, already sounding annoyed. They talked over me, explaining, defending, smoothing things down. No one asked why I'd reached that point. No one mentioned the mornings of being called toothpick, the comments about needing meat on my bones, the way my name had been replaced by a label before I'd even learned everyone else's schedules. I opened my mouth to speak, then closed it. The words felt useless in that moment, like frosting scraped off a cake no one wanted anymore. I could feel the cold air from the display case on my ankles, a reminder that I didn't belong where it was warm. The owner sighed again, the same tired sound from before. "You should apologize," he said, looking at me like I was the problem that needed fixing. "Let's not make this bigger than it is." I looked at her, at the tears, at the coworkers hovering around her in comfort. I thought of the way she'd smiled when she called me slim, the way she'd dismissed me when I asked her to stop. I thought of how quickly the room had chosen a side. "I'll apologize," I said slowly, surprising even myself, "when she stops calling me that." The room went quiet again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was tense, coiled, like something waiting to spring. And as I stood there under those harsh lights, surrounded by people who had already decided who was wrong, I realized this wasn't going to end with a simple apology. The rest of that shift passed like I was moving through water that had suddenly turned thick and cold. No one spoke to me directly. Orders were called out without eye contact, names clipped, movements exaggeratedly polite. I noticed how my coworkers angled their bodies away from me, how conversations stopped when I stepped closer to the prep table. The shop still smelled of sugar and vanilla, but underneath it was something sour, like milk just beginning to turn. She didn't look at me again. She stayed near the register, eyes red, dabbing at them whenever a customer came in, making sure they could see how shaken she was. Every time someone glanced her way with concern, she nodded faintly, the picture of wounded innocence. I kept frosting cupcakes, my hands steady out of habit more than calm, counting each swirl of icing like it was something solid I could hold on to. When the lunch rush hit, the pressure tightened. The bell rang constantly, the door opening and closing in quick succession, letting in bursts of warm air from outside. Customers smiled, joked, complimented the display. None of them knew what had settled behind the counter. None of them saw how my coworker leaned in toward another employee and whispered something, eyes flicking toward me. A laugh followed, low, contained. I focused on the task in front of me. Box, lid, sticker, receipt. My reflection in the glass stared back, pale under the lights, lips pressed thin. I told myself I was here to work, not to be liked. I told myself this wasn't my first job, my first uncomfortable room, my first time being the odd one out. But my chest felt tight anyway. At one point, she brushed past me deliberately, shoulder grazing mine harder than necessary. "Careful," she murmured, not looking back. The words sounded less like concern and more like a warning. I stepped back, almost bumping into the rack of cooling trays. The metal rattled softly. No one commented, no one asked if I was okay. The owner hovered near the espresso machine, wiping the same spot on the counter over and over. He avoided my eyes. When I caught his attention once, hoping, foolishly, for some sign that he might step in, he glanced away immediately, shoulders tensing as if even acknowledging me would pull him into something he refused to deal with. I swallowed and kept working. The rest of the staff moved around me like I was a piece of furniture that had been placed in an inconvenient spot, not worth removing, but easy enough to work around. When someone needed a tray I was using, they waited in pointed silence instead of asking. When I finished with the sink, another coworker stepped in without a word, bumping my elbow with her hip. I felt smaller by the minute. During a brief lull, I reached for my water bottle, only to find it gone from where I'd set it. I looked around, confused, then spotted it on a shelf across the room, tucked behind a box of napkins. She was standing nearby, arms crossed, watching me with a look that was almost curious. "Looking for something?" she asked lightly. I retrieved the bottle without answering. My hands trembled just enough that the cap rattled when I twisted it open. I took a sip, the water lukewarm and metallic tasting, and set it back down closer to me this time. She smiled faintly and turned away. By mid-afternoon, my head ached, not from the work, but from the constant vigilance, the effort of keeping my posture neutral, my expression unreadable. I measured every word before speaking, every movement before making it. The shop felt narrower than it had that morning, the walls inching closer together. A customer lingered at the counter, chatting with one of my coworkers about weekend plans. They laughed easily, leaning in toward each other. I stood a few feet away, waiting for my cue, invisible again. When the customer finally left, the coworker glanced at me, hesitated, then said, "You know, you really shouldn't have said that." I met her eyes. "I asked her to stop," I replied quietly. She sighed, already tired of the conversation. "It's just different. You know that." Different. The word hung there, vague and final. I nodded once, not trusting myself to say anything else. There was no point. I could feel it now, the way the story had been told without me. The way my single word had been pulled out of its context and held up as proof of my cruelty, while everything that led to it had been erased. As closing time approached, the tension didn't ease. If anything, it sharpened. She avoided me entirely now, but her presence filled the room anyway, her silence louder than her comments had been. When she spoke to others, her voice was subdued, wounded, carefully controlled. Each time someone glanced at her with sympathy, something twisted in my stomach. I cleaned my station slowly, deliberately, wiping down surfaces until they gleamed. The repetitive motion helped me breathe. I reminded myself that I'd only been here 8 days, that I didn't owe these people anything beyond my work, that I could walk away if I had to. But the thought of leaving, of starting over again, exhausted me. The owner finally called us together to lock up. He cleared his throat, eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder. "Let's all try to be more respectful tomorrow," he said, vague enough to mean nothing. "We don't need drama." No one looked at me when he said it, but I felt the weight of it settle squarely on my back. As we gathered our things, she brushed past me again, this time whispering just loud enough for me to hear. "I hope you feel good about yourself." I stood there, keys in hand, heart pounding, watching her walk out ahead of me into the fading afternoon light. The bell over the door chimed softly as it closed behind her, a sound that felt like the end of something fragile I hadn't even realized I was still holding on to. And in that moment, standing alone behind the counter, I understood that this wasn't just about a word anymore. It was about how quickly a room could turn against you and how little protection you had when it did. I have always measured my life in workdays and quiet sacrifices, not in grand moments anyone else would notice. When I think back far enough, the earliest memories that come to me aren't birthdays or holidays. They're mornings, cold ones. The kind where the house was still dark, the air sharp in my lungs as I slipped my feet into shoes by the door so I wouldn't wake anyone. My mother worked nights. My father was gone more often than he was home, and by the time I was 12, I understood that if something needed doing, you didn't wait for permission. You just did it. I learned early how to make myself small without disappearing, how to move through rooms quietly, how to finish a task without asking for praise. There was a kind of safety in being useful. In my 20s, when other women talked about dreams and adventures, I talked about schedules. I married young, not out of romance, but out of practicality. He was steady. He paid bills on time. He liked that I didn't ask for much. We built a life that looked fine from the outside. Rented houses, secondhand furniture, careful budgeting scribbled into a little spiral notebook I carried everywhere. That notebook went with me to grocery stores, to jobs, to the kitchen table late at night. It held numbers, reminders, lists of what could wait and what couldn't. It became my quiet companion. I worked wherever I could. Retail, cleaning offices after hours. A bakery once, years ago, where I learned how to keep my hands steady even when my back ached and my feet burned. I learned the rhythm of ovens, the patience of dough, the way repetition could calm a restless mind. There was comfort in honest work, in knowing that effort turned into something tangible you could hand to someone else. Money was always tight. There were months when dinner was toast and tea, when I counted change at the counter and pretended not to see the cashier's impatience. I lost weight without trying. People commented on it then too. "You're so thin," they'd say, sometimes with envy, sometimes with concern. I learned to smile and deflect, to make it a joke. It was easier than explaining hunger as a habit, not a phase. When my marriage ended, quietly and without drama, I didn't feel shock so much as relief. We had grown into two people who shared space, but not much else. I packed my things into boxes, including that spiral notebook, now thick with years of crossed-out plans and adjusted expectations. I moved into a small apartment that smelled faintly of old paint and warm dust. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I kept working. Jobs came and went. Some managers were kind. Some barely noticed me. I learned which places valued reliability and which ones saw it as something to exploit. I stayed longer than I should have more than once, telling myself it was easier to endure than to start over. At my age, people like to remind you of your replaceability, even when they rely on you to keep things running. There were stretches where loneliness pressed in hard, especially in the evenings. I'd sit at my narrow kitchen table, the notebook open, making lists I didn't really need, just to feel the comfort of order. The scratch of pen on paper grounded me. It reminded me that I was still here, still capable of keeping things together. I didn't have children. That absence became something people felt entitled to comment on too, as if it were a gap they could fill with advice or pity. I learned to nod, to let their words pass through me without settling. Not everything needs an answer. As I got older, my body changed in ways both expected and surprising. My bones felt closer to the surface. My appetite came and went. Doctors shrugged and told me to eat more protein, to worry less. I did what I could. I walked, I stretched, I kept going. Work was the constant thread. It gave my days shape when nothing else did. So when I took the job at the cupcake shop, it felt like a small mercy. A place with daylight, predictable hours, simple tasks. I told myself it would be temporary, a bridge between chapters. The first morning, I brought my old spiral notebook with me out of habit, slipping it into my bag even though I didn't need it. It was worn now, the cover soft at the edges, pages filled with the history of my survival. The shop itself was bright, all pastel colors and glass displays, warm ovens, sweet air. I liked the way the work kept my hands busy. I liked learning where everything went, how the day flowed. For a moment, I let myself believe this could be easy. But history has a way of repeating itself in small, familiar ways. There have always been people who feel entitled to comment on bodies, on choices, on things that are none of their business. I've met them in break rooms, behind counters, in passing remarks that linger longer than they should. I've learned that it's rarely about concern. It's about power, about reminding someone where they stand. I don't like confrontation. Never have. My instinct is to smooth things over, to ask nicely, to assume good intentions until proven otherwise. That instinct has kept me safe in some ways and vulnerable in others. I know that now. Thinking back, there were signs even before that first morning slim. A look held a beat too long, a smile that didn't quite match the eyes. I recognized them the way you recognize a change in weather, subtle but unmistakable if you've lived through enough storms. I told myself it was nothing, that I was tired, that I was projecting old experiences onto a new place. I wanted this job to work. I wanted a corner of my life that didn't require armor. That wanting has always been my weakness. As I stand here now, remembering all of this, I can see the pattern clearly. How often I've been expected to absorb discomfort quietly. How often my silence has been mistaken for permission. The notebook in my bag felt heavier those days, like it carried not just numbers and lists, but the accumulated weight of years spent accommodating others. There's a moment when you've lived long enough, when you realize you're tired of explaining yourself, tired of asking to be treated with basic respect. That realization doesn't come with a burst of confidence or a clever speech. It comes quietly, settling in your bones. And as the days at the shop continued, that quiet realization began to stir again, familiar and unwelcome, reminding me that this wasn't just another job. It was another test of how much I was willing to endure. The shift after that felt heavier than the ones before, as if the air itself had learned how to press down on me. It started small, always small. That was how it worked. When I walked in, The lights were already on, bright and unforgiving, reflecting off the glass cases so harshly I had to blink. She was there before me, leaning against the counter, laughing with the others. The sound cut off the moment she saw me, not abruptly, just adjusted, like someone lowering the volume on a radio. "Morning," I said, neutral, professional. No one answered right away. Then someone muttered, "Hey," without looking up. She didn't speak at all. She just watched me hang my coat, her eyes tracking every movement. When I tied my apron, my fingers fumbled with the knot. I felt it then. The first silence of the day. Not empty. Loaded. The kind that makes your throat tighten for no logical reason. I went to wash my hands. The sink was splattered with frosting and crumbs. Left that way intentionally, I realized. I cleaned it without comment. As I reached for paper towels, the dispenser was empty. "Did anyone refill this?" I asked. No answer. I stood there for a moment, water dripping from my hands onto the floor, waiting. My breath felt shallow, stuck halfway in. Finally, I wiped my hands on my apron and moved on. Behind me, I heard a soft laugh. Later, when I reached for a tray of chocolate cupcakes cooling on the rack, she stepped forward casually and took it first. "I need these," she said, already turning away. "I was assigned," I began. She didn't stop. "You can grab something else," she replied, light and dismissive, like she was doing me a favor. I did. I always did. By mid-morning, the shop was busy. Orders piled up. The rhythm should have been familiar by now, but everything felt slightly off, like I was constantly half a step behind. Instructions were given too quickly or not at all. When I asked for clarification, I got sighs, eye rolls. One coworker said, "We went over this already," though we hadn't. Once, when I misheard an order and corrected it immediately, she leaned close enough that I could smell her perfume. Sweet, heavy, cloying. "You're so sensitive," she murmured, smiling. "It's hard to joke with you." I froze. Not outwardly, just inside. My hands went cold. The room seemed to tilt for a second, then right itself. I nodded and stepped back. The silences multiplied after that. Silences when I entered a room. Silences after I spoke. Silences that stretched just long enough to make me question whether I'd imagined saying anything at all. In those gaps, my mind filled in the worst possibilities, that I was being talked about, that decisions were being made without me. At one point, the owner came out and asked how things were going. She answered before I could. "Better," she said. "We're managing." He smiled, relieved, and went back to the office. Managing. The word lodged itself under my skin. Around noon, I realized my name hadn't been used once all day. Not by her, not by anyone. It was always she, or nothing at all. A gesture, a nod, a glance. I was present but unnamed, like a problem no one wanted to articulate. During a lull, I opened my bag to grab my notebook, intending to jot down the next day's prep list. It wasn't there. I felt a flicker of panic. I checked again, more thoroughly this time, fingers digging into the corners of my bag. Nothing. I looked around the prep area, scanning the counters, the shelves. "Looking for something?" she asked from behind me. "My notebook," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I had it with me." She tilted her head, pretending to think. "Oh, that?" She reached under the counter and pulled it out, holding it loosely between two fingers. "You left it out. I moved it. Didn't think you'd mind." The cover was bent now, a crease running diagonally across it. My chest tightened. "I'd prefer you not touch my things," I said. She raised her eyebrows. "Wow. Okay." She handed it back like it was something distasteful. "I was just trying to help." One of the others glanced over, then away. No one said anything. I slipped the notebook back into my bag, hands trembling just enough that the zipper buzzed against the metal teeth. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, to get through the day. The afternoon dragged. Tasks were reassigned without explanation. I was sent to clean the storage area, a cramped, cold space in the back where the floor always felt damp and the light flickered. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded final. I stood there for a moment, surrounded by boxes and the hum of the old refrigerator, and felt my eyes burn. I pressed my lips together hard, refusing to let the feeling spill over. Crying would only make it worse. Crying would give them something else to use. I cleaned slowly, methodically, my breath fogging slightly in the chill. My hands shook when I reached up to wipe a shelf, the cold biting into my fingers. For a brief, irrational moment, I thought about leaving, about taking off my apron and walking out the back door without a word. The thought passed. It always did. When I returned to the front, no one acknowledged me. Orders continued. Laughter rose and fell around me, always just out of reach. I moved where I was told, when I was told, shrinking into myself with each hour. Near closing time, I overheard her talking to another coworker near the sink. I mean, if she can't handle a nickname, maybe this isn't the place for her, she said softly. I know, the other replied. She makes things uncomfortable. I stopped moving. The words hit harder because they were said so calmly, so reasonably, like a conclusion already reached. She noticed me then. Our eyes met. She didn't look away. She smiled, small and tight, and turned back to her conversation. Something in me collapsed quietly, not all at once, just a settling, like a building finally giving in after too much pressure. I finished my tasks without speaking. My body felt heavy, unresponsive. When I took off my apron, my hands trembled again, more noticeably this time. I hid them by gripping the counter until the shaking passed. As we locked up, no one waited for me. They filed out together, talking about plans, about dinner, about anything but what had been happening right in front of them. I followed last, the door closing behind me with that familiar chime. Outside, the air was cooler, the sky already darkening. I stood there for a moment, keys in my hand, unable to move. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get a full breath no matter how hard I tried. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes, just for a second. My hands shook again, and this time I couldn't stop them. I pressed them together hard until the feeling dulled. I told myself this was temporary, that I could endure a little longer, that I always had. But as I finally walked to my car, shoulders hunched, I couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted, and that whatever came next would not be something I could quietly absorb anymore. The moment that changed everything didn't come with shouting or tears. It came with a piece of paper. I arrived early that morning, the sky still pale, the shop quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerators. I liked those minutes before everyone else arrived. They gave me space to breathe. I set my bag down, hung my coat, and reached for my apron. A white envelope sat on the counter where I usually worked. My name was written on the front in the owner's handwriting. Neat, careful, impersonal. I stood there for a second, staring at it, my fingers hovering just above the paper. Something in my chest tightened. Not fear exactly, but recognition. I had seen envelopes like this before. They never carried good news. I opened it. Inside was a typed note. Short, formal. It said there had been a complaint about my conduct, that my comment had created a hostile work environment, that moving forward I was expected to maintain professionalism and avoid personal remarks. There was no mention of what had led to it, no acknowledgement of my earlier concerns, just a warning, framed as guidance. I read it twice, then a third time. The words stayed the same, but something inside me shifted. The familiar instinct to apologize, to explain, to soften myself rose up automatically. I could almost hear my own voice offering peace at any cost. But this time, I didn't speak. I folded the paper carefully and set it down. My hands were steady. That surprised me. She arrived a few minutes later, chatting loudly as she came in, her mood noticeably lighter than it had been in days. When she saw the envelope on the counter, her eyes flicked to it, then to me. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Not wide, not obvious, just enough. I met her gaze and didn't look away. She blinked first. That was the moment, not the envelope, not the note, the realization. I saw it clearly then. This wasn't misunderstanding. It wasn't clumsiness or humor gone wrong. It was strategy. She had learned how to wound without leaving marks, how to provoke just enough to get a reaction, then step back and let others do the rest. And I had been playing my part perfectly. The owner came out from the back, coffee in hand, eyes tired. "Did you get my note?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded, relieved that I wasn't arguing. "Good, let's just move on." Move on. Another familiar phrase. The rest of the morning unfolded normally on the surface. Orders, frosting, small talk. But something had changed in me. I noticed details I'd missed before. The way she positioned herself between me and others during conversations. The way instructions were relayed through someone else instead of directly to me. The way my tasks were documented suddenly, while hers were not. I didn't react. I observed. When she passed by and murmured, "No hard feelings," I simply nodded. Inside, a quiet clarity settled in. This wasn't about being liked. It wasn't even about fairness. It was about control. And the only reason she had any was because I kept handing it to her, hoping it would buy me peace. At one point, the owner asked me to restock supplies in the back. As I walked past him, I caught my reflection in the darkened office window. I looked tired, older than I felt most days, but there was something else there too, a firmness I hadn't seen in a long time. In the storage room, I stood still for a moment, hands on a box, breathing slowly. The cold didn't bother me this time. My thoughts were sharp, orderly. I replayed the last week in my mind, not emotionally but factually. The comments, the silences, the missing notebook, the whispering. The way my concern had been dismissed, then rewritten as aggression. Patterns emerged when I stopped trying to excuse them. I returned to the front and finished my tasks. I answered questions directly. I kept my tone neutral. When she tried to draw me into a joke at my own expense, I didn't respond at all. The lack of reaction unsettled her more than any word could have. By the end of the shift, I felt drained, but not defeated. As I gathered my things, the owner approached again. "Everything okay now?" he asked, hopeful. "Yes," I said, and for the first time it was true in a way he didn't understand. I walked out into the evening air with the folded note still in my bag, its edges pressing against my side like a reminder. I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine, staring straight ahead. I wasn't angry. I wasn't afraid. I was done being confused. And as I pulled out of the lot, a single, steady thought formed, clearer than anything I'd felt in days. If they were going to document me, then I would make sure there was a record of everything else, too. I didn't change my behavior the next day. That was the point. I arrived on time. I greeted everyone politely. I did my work the way I always had. Careful, thorough, quiet. No sarcasm, no edge, no explanations. I gave them nothing new to react to, nothing that could be twisted. What I did change was where my attention went. I bought a small notebook on the way in, plain cover, stiff spine. I didn't bring the old spiral one anymore. That one stayed at home now, safe in a drawer. This one was for facts only, dates, times, words exactly as spoken. I kept it in my bag, not on the counter, not where anyone could move it to help. The first entry came sooner than I expected. "Morning, Slim," she said again, softer this time, almost playful, as if the last few days had reset the rules. I didn't respond. I walked past her, straight to the sink. 10 minutes later, I wrote it down in the storage room, my pen pressing hard enough to leave an imprint on the next page. I started noticing how often she spoke just out of earshot of others, how she waited until my hands were full before making comments, before blocking my path, before assigning herself the easier tasks and leaving me the rest. None of it dramatic, all of it consistent. The owner remained distant. When I asked a simple question about inventory levels, he answered curtly, eyes already drifting away. Once, I caught him watching us from the doorway, his face tense, like he was hoping the problem would resolve itself if he didn't acknowledge it long enough. I stopped going to him. Instead, I focused on documenting, on observing, without reacting. When she whispered to another coworker and they both glanced at me, I noted the time. When instructions were changed after I followed them, I wrote that down too. When my schedule was adjusted without explanation, I took a photo of the posted hours before and after. The notebook filled slowly, deliberately. Each page felt like laying down a thin plank over deep water. There were moments when my resolve wavered. Once, in the back room, she stood too close again, her voice low. "You really should learn to take a joke," she said. "Life's easier that way." My chest tightened. The old instinct surged, to defend myself, to explain, to ask why she was doing this. I said nothing. I stepped away. Later, my hand shook slightly as I wrote the words down. I paused, took a breath, and kept going. I began to see how the others followed her lead. Not out of cruelty exactly, but out of convenience. It was easier to align with the louder presence, the one who seemed more confident, more established. I was newer, quieter, easier to dismiss. One coworker, the youngest among us, caught my eye one afternoon as she passed me a box of liners. Her expression flickered, something like uncertainty, maybe even regret. She didn't say anything, but she didn't smile either. It was the first sign that not everyone was fully comfortable with what was happening. I noted that too, not in the notebook, but in myself. At home, I reviewed my notes each night. I copied dates onto a separate sheet. I organized them chronologically. The process was calming in a way I hadn't expected. It reminded me of balancing budgets years ago, of finding order where there had been chaos. Control didn't come from confrontation. It came from clarity. Midweek, an email arrived from the owner. Brief. It reiterated expectations about professionalism. It mentioned ongoing concerns. I printed it. The printer whirred loudly in my quiet apartment, the paper warm when I pulled it free. I placed it in a folder with the note from before, smoothing the edges carefully. My hands were steady again. The next day, she noticed the change in me. I could tell. She tried different approaches: lightness, silence, exaggerated kindness. "Want help with that?" she offered once, smiling too brightly. "No," I said simply. "I've got it." Her smile faltered. Another time, she raised her voice slightly, ensuring others could hear. "I feel like I'm walking on eggshells now," she said. "I don't want to offend anyone." No one responded. The moment hung there, awkward. I wrote it down. The pressure didn't disappear, but it shifted. She became more careful, more indirect. The owner watched more closely, though he still didn't intervene. I could feel something building. Not explosively, but steadily, like a structure being assembled piece by piece. One afternoon, the young coworker lingered after her shift ended. She pretended to wipe down the counter again, then leaned closer to me when no one else was nearby. "I heard what she said to you earlier," she whispered. "That wasn't okay." I met her eyes. "Thank you." She hesitated. "She does it to people," she added. "Just usually not this obvious." That night, I wrote her words down too, careful to note they were overheard, not yet offered formally. I didn't push. I didn't ask for anything. I let the truth sit where it belonged. By the end of the week, my folder held notes, emails, schedule changes, times, patterns, nothing explosive on its own. Together, they told a story. I didn't know yet how it would end. I didn't know whether anyone would listen. But I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet readiness. As I closed the folder and slid it into my bag that Friday evening, I sensed the air around me shift again, like a held breath waiting to be released. The confrontation didn't happen in the way I once imagined it would. There was no shouting match across the counter, no dramatic accusation hurled in the middle of a rush, no moment where everyone suddenly turned and stared at me in disbelief. It happened on a Tuesday morning under the harshest overhead light in the shop, with the smell of burnt coffee hanging faintly in the air. The owner called us together before opening. All 6 of us stood near the prep table, arms folded, coffee cups in hand. He cleared his throat and said he wanted to reset the tone after receiving continued concerns. His eyes flicked to me, then away. I felt my pulse steady instead of spike. That was new. She stood across from me, chin lifted, expression carefully neutral. Not smiling, not scowling, the picture of restraint. If anyone walked in at that moment, they would have seen exactly who the reasonable one was supposed to be. The owner spoke for another minute about professionalism, about teamwork, about how small businesses couldn't afford conflict. His words blurred together. I waited. When he finally paused, he looked at me. "Do you have anything you want to say?" 6 pairs of eyes turned. For a fraction of a second, the old reflex stirred, the urge to soften, to reassure, to apologize just enough to make this end. I reached into my bag instead. The sound of the zipper was louder than it should have been. The room went still. I pulled out the folder, thick now, its edges worn from being handled every night that week. I placed it on the table between us. "Yes," I said. My voice didn't shake. "I do." She frowned slightly, just enough to suggest confusion. "What's that?" "Documentation," I replied. The word landed differently than complaint ever had. I opened the folder slowly, deliberately, and slid the first paper forward. "This is the note I received last week," I said, "about my conduct." The owner nodded, already uncomfortable. I slid the next page forward. "This is the email you sent afterward." I didn't look at her yet. I didn't need to. I could feel the shift in the room, the subtle tightening. Then I began. I read dates, times, exact phrases, not emotionally, factually. Each entry was brief, precise. "Morning, Slim," repeated on 3 different days, a comment about my body made while my hands were full, my notebook being taken and returned damaged. Instructions changed after the fact. A remark about me being too sensitive, made in close proximity, without witnesses. I watched the owner's face as the pattern emerged. His jaw tightened, his posture changed. She crossed her arms. "This is ridiculous," she said lightly. "You're twisting things." I finally looked at her. "I'm reading what was said," I replied, word for word. She laughed, short and sharp. "You wrote it down after the fact. Anyone could do that." I nodded once, which is why I also have this. I turned the folder again and placed the printed email on top, then a photo of the posted schedule with timestamps, then another photo showing the altered version. The sound of paper sliding against paper felt oddly satisfying. "And this," I continued, lifting my phone, "a message sent to me after hours suggesting I learn to take jokes so things wouldn't be difficult." Her smile vanished completely. "I didn't mean it like that," she said quickly. "You know that." The youngest coworker shifted beside me. Her fingers tightened around her cup. She took a breath, then spoke before she could stop herself. "I heard her say it," she said quietly, "more than once." The room froze. Everyone turned to her. She swallowed. The comments about her body, I heard them. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to get involved. No one moved. No one interrupted. Another coworker cleared his throat. He said slowly, "I've noticed the tension too. It's not just one incident." The owner's face had gone pale. He looked from me to the folder, then to her. "Why wasn't this brought to me sooner?" he asked, voice strained. I answered before she could. It was. Silence fell again, this one heavier than all the others. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, support, distraction, an exit. "I was just joking," she said louder now. "She's overreacting. Everyone knows that being skinny isn't an insult." I didn't raise my voice. "I asked you to stop," I said, more than once. "That doesn't mean—" "And you told me it was your mouth and you could say what you wanted," I finished. The words seemed to drain the color from her face. The owner pressed his hands flat on the table. "Enough," he said. The room felt like it exhaled all at once. He looked at her. This isn't about intention anymore, it's about behavior. And there's a pattern here. She stared at him, disbelief giving way to anger. So you're taking her side now? I'm looking at the facts, he replied. She laughed again, but it sounded brittle. This is unbelievable. No one joined in. I closed the folder gently. The sound was soft, final. I didn't want this, I said. I wanted to do my job. Her eyes snapped back to me. For the first time, there was no mask, just something raw and exposed. You could have just apologized, she hissed. I met her gaze steadily. I did, I said. I apologized for asking you to treat me with respect. The room went completely still. The owner straightened. We're going to need to take some steps, he said, effective immediately. She shook her head, already stepping back. You can't be serious. I am, he replied. I didn't stay for the rest of it. I didn't need to hear the details. As they continued talking, I picked up my bag and walked toward the door, the overhead lights buzzing softly above me. No one stopped me. As I stepped outside, the morning air felt cool and clean against my face. I took a deep breath, the first full one in days. Behind me, through the glass, I could see her still standing there, arms crossed tightly now, her confidence finally unraveling as the room no longer bent around her. And for the first time since I'd walked into that shop, I knew, without doubt, that the story being told about me had finally changed. The shop felt different after that, even though nothing about it had changed. The same glass cases, the same pastel walls, the same hum of refrigerators beneath the counters. But the air no longer pressed down on me when I stepped inside. It moved, it breathed, it left space where there hadn't been any before. She wasn't there when I returned the next morning. No announcement was made, no explanation offered. The owner avoided unnecessary conversation, his movements stiff, chastened. He assigned tasks clearly this time, looking at me when he spoke. It wasn't warmth, it wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And that mattered more than he probably realized. The others were quieter, more careful with their words. When they spoke to me, they used my name. That alone felt like a small restoration. I did my work steadily, without the constant scan of my surroundings, without bracing myself for the next remark or the next silence. My shoulders lowered an inch. My breath settled into a rhythm that felt familiar, almost forgotten. For the first time in weeks, I noticed the warmth of the ovens without flinching, the soft whir of the mixer like background music instead of noise. During a lull, the youngest coworker stood beside me, wiping down the counter. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I should have said something sooner." I nodded. "Thank you for saying something when it mattered." She smiled, relieved, and moved on. At the end of the shift, the owner asked me into the office. The light there was softer, filtered through a dusty window. He cleared his throat and said he hadn't handled things well, that he should have listened earlier. He didn't say sorry outright, but his discomfort spoke louder than the word would have. "I'd like you to stay," he said finally, "if you want to." I considered it. Not out of fear, not out of habit, but honestly. I weighed how my body felt in that space now, how my mind responded to the thought of coming back. "I will," I said, "as long as things stay professional." "They will," he replied quickly. I left the office with a sense of boundary restored, not because someone had given it to me, but because I had held it. That night at home, I took out the old spiral notebook from the drawer, the one with softened edges and years of lists pressed into its pages. I ran my fingers over the cover, feeling the faint grooves where the pen had once pressed too hard. For so long, it had been a record of survival. What I could afford, what I had to sacrifice, what I needed to endure. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I set it on the table and poured myself a cup of tea. I sat there quietly, letting the steam rise, letting the day settle. When I finally did open the notebook, I didn't add a list. I didn't calculate anything. I wrote a single line on a clean page. I wrote my name, Just that. The act felt grounding, almost ceremonial. The notebook wasn't a shield anymore. It wasn't something I used to justify my place. It was simply mine, holding a life that had weathered more than most people ever saw. In the days that followed, the shop returned to its routine. Customers came and went, orders were filled, cupcakes were boxed and handed over with smiles. The conflict faded into something that no longer defined the space, or me. I noticed how differently I carried myself now, how I spoke when something didn't feel right, how I didn't rush to smooth over discomfort that wasn't mine to fix. There was strength in that restraint, a quiet kind that didn't need to announce itself. I'm not proud of how things unfolded. Pride isn't the right word. What I feel is clarity, the kind that comes when you stop doubting your own experience and start trusting it instead. That old notebook still sits on my table. Sometimes I open it, sometimes I don't. But now, when I see it, I don't think of what I had to give up to survive. I think of what I chose to protect. If my story touched you, let me know. That notebook once held only what I owed the world. Now it reminds me of what I owe myself. And if you've ever stood in a room where your name disappeared, I hope you find your way back to it too.